Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton.
And I'm Markus.
And today we'll be talking all about the results from the 2024 presidential election. So on November 5th, Donald Trump won a second term as president of the United States. He did this by improving his margins from 2016 and 2020 in almost every single state. Trump won 312 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 226 and flipped the states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Republicans also won the U.S. House and the Senate. They won 53 seats in the U.S. Senate and roughly 220 seats in the House, with a narrow majority in both chambers. So, Markus, what do you make of this decisive victory by the Republicans, by Donald Trump, and how do you think that he managed to pull this off?
Yeah, when you just put that all in retrospect, it's like, damn, good job. From people who come from working strictly in politics, yeah, good job. You did good. I think the one thing that we have to recognize is that voters were very upset with just government in general. They've been upset with government in general. And history has shown that the party that typically holds power when people are not happy, there's war going on in the Middle East, and that there is, rampant inflation and costs are out of control, that the party usually in power loses. And not only did the Democrats lose, but they got obliterated throughout the country. I think it just shows the fact that working class Americans are frustrated with government and that they want to see a change. Now, may this change be good for the working class? Definitely not. But I think that is what the people of America have chosen. A president who says, eating the dogs and cats and many, many crazy lines that some we can't even say.
So after the election, some of the pundits are framing the results as a racial realignment of Hispanic voters who backed Democrats in previous presidential elections, including in 2020, by roughly 63% nationally, and now back the Democratic Party in 2024 by only 55%. This trend among Hispanic voters is concerning to the Democratic Party, as Hispanic voters are generally younger than the electorate at large, and if this trend continues, it could be disastrous for the party in the long term. But the Democrats are also concerned with the trends among all young voters who supported the Democrats this year by roughly 52% nationally. That's down from their 2020 numbers as well. So, Markus, what do you make of these demographic results, and why do you think such a shift occurred among the very groups that Donald Trump and Republicans have targeted?
I think it comes from years of effort from the Republican Party to invest long-term into these groups. You've seen groups like Turning Point USA, PragerU, who have been very, very successful to a certain extent and investing long-term into college students and younger voters. And in that election, that Republicans have put millions of dollars into youth organizations, and it's paid off, to where Democrats historically have not traditionally invested into their youth organizations. And we've seen that this is exactly what the results you get with the money you pay. And I think that is what I'm taking away from that aspect. I think for Hispanic voters, I think the biggest thing is that looking at the border, Donald Trump, specifically in Arizona, as proud Arizonan, made that such a divisive issue, but also made it as an issue is that, you came across the border legally. You became a citizen, and there is other people coming across the border who are not a citizen are coming over and quote unquote taking your jobs. And so I think some of that rhetoric kind of resonated, and fear mongering was able to persuade Hispanic voters to go with the Republican Party this year. And also the fact that Trump said, before I left office in 2020, yes, the world may have been on fire, but hey, your gas was $2. Hey, your house was $190,000. And And now, 4 years later, I'm at the same time frame, your house is double the price. Your gas actually is back at what it was when I was president before, but no mention to say that. But your gas is still $4. Like, there was literature that the Trump campaign was handing out in my neighborhood that said gas prices were at $5 under the Biden administration when gas down was $2.80. I think rhetoric like that really resonated with working class families, and they were able to persuade them.
Yeah, of course. Let's talk more about the economic concerns, because I think that, according to the exit polls, economic anxiety was the primary reason why voters did make that choice to switch between supporting Democrats in previous years and voting for Trump this time. Among voters' top economic concerns, as you mentioned, Marcus, was the price of everyday goods. And throughout the campaign, Kamala Harris spent extensive amounts of time discussing her plans to go after corporate price gouging, while Donald Trump talked about his plans to enact extensive tariffs on all foreign goods that would raise prices for everyday products that Americans purchase. This didn't really break through. So, Marcus, why do you think that there was such a disconnect between the actual economic plans of the candidates and that perception that, Donald Trump was more responsible with the economy when he was in office?
I think the biggest thing is I can look back to, talking to my parents who are very working class people. And my mom's a single mother and went through, so she knows the familiar of raising children and having to live paycheck to paycheck. I talked to her. She voted for Kamala Harris, but she said, 4 years ago under Trump, I bought my house during the Trump administration for $160,000 brand new. And now that house is worth, at the end of the Biden administration, is now worth almost $500,000, less than 10 years. And so I think that we have to recognize that we all know corporations are a big part of why prices have gone up. And corporations have used their increasing on pricing against the incumbent party, which was the Democrats, to enable working class families to support Republicans up and down the ballot because they can say their life will be better. But I think the biggest thing is that in terms of what people saw, people were going to the grocery store. They were seeing prices continuing to go up. They weren't seeing them going down. And as Vice President Harris had a really great economic message, I think it just wasn't connecting with actual working class people.
Yeah, and one of the messages that Trump was trying to push throughout the campaign was specifically the message that Democrats were, in the Republican Party's view, irresponsibly using tax money to pay for things like gender-affirming care for incarcerated individuals. There was a famous ad where, the Trump campaign said, Kamala's for they, them, Trump is for you. We've all seen it. So this was one of the most famous ads in that campaign cycle. But Marcus, what do you think the impact was from this particular message? And do you think that was able to have a real impact on the election result?
I think it actually did play a big impact. I think it particularly played a big impact in the Latino community. It actually played a fact with my dad, which is funny because that ad would come on, and that actually literally persuaded my dad to end up voting for Trump. And so conversations like that and things like that actually did work, particularly on people who are not very politically aware or not always politically connected, but they see a TV ad where, Vice President Harris literally herself said that trans people should be allowed to get a transition in prison, and that people's taxpayer dollars will be going to that. It was on in Arizona, and it was pretty effective. It actually worked.
Yeah.
It's disgusting because trans people should have the right to do their own thing with their body, but it worked. Identity politics did hurt the Democrats a lot, and we saw that. I say it, but when you're a single mom living off a paycheck to paycheck, and all you're hearing your local politicians talk about identity and equity and all of this, it's great, it's important, but what are you going to do to help my pocketbook? And I think that's kind of where voters' minds were at. And they saw Trump, and Trump was like, well, I'm going to make life better for you.
What was that conversation like with you and your dad?
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. He doesn't believe that government taxpayer funding should go towards people in prison who want to transition to whoever they think they are. That's kind of what his argument was. And from there, that was a big part as to why he ended up deciding to vote for Trump.
I mean, I think that's such a powerful story about what happened in this election. Honestly, like I haven't heard from people in my community in Boston and the liberal East Coast much of that experience at all. But I think it's so valuable to hear that because that's what made the difference in this election. And Markus, do you know if your dad? It's okay if you don't want to say this, but do you know if your dad voted for Biden in 2020?
Yeah, both my parents did.
That's interesting. Yeah, so he made that choice to switch over. So another issue that you raised a few minutes ago was the issue of immigration. This is another one of the top issues in this election, according to Pew Research Center. Throughout his time on the public scene, Donald Trump has rhetorically made clear that he would do everything possible to stop undocumented immigrants from living in the United States and would do this by having the military conduct mass deportations. He talked about this extensively on the campaign trail this year. While Republicans blocked a bipartisan compromise bill on border security earlier in the year, the American public still favors the Republican Party's approach and positions on the issue of immigration. And Donald Trump on the national scene has kind of moved the overturned window of what is acceptable in this political debate. Now we see that a majority of Americans are supporting mass deportations, are supporting the construction of a border wall. And that's different from 2016 and 2020. So, Markus, why do you think that Democrats keep losing on this specific issue of immigration so badly? And what do you think that we can do to try to win voters' trust back?
Yeah, I think this issue, being from Arizona, it's the thing I'm not used to hearing about in politics. I think the biggest thing is that it's really interesting because we had a proposition 314, which was a proposition to basically what we call an SB 1070, which relates to Sheriff Ohio in the early thousands, which essentially would allow law enforcement to stop anybody that they think is immigrant and just arrest them. And so that proposition did pass overwhelmingly, like in the low 60s. In Arizona. And so I think it just shows the fact that our border cities are hurting. They've been hurting for a very long time. The city of Nogales down in Arizona is a very, very popular city that most politicians go to when they visit Arizona to talk about the border. Good friend of mine's on the school board down there and owns a farming company down there, and that they've seen that it's a disaster from both sides of the aisle. It's a complete disaster, the immigration system. Apparently, I think if the Biden-Harris administration just acknowledged the fact that immigration is happening, it is a crisis. We are going to try to fix it. Yes, we're going to go visit the border. I think that's really what people used against her when she first got elected. She said something like she wasn't going to visit the border. She was going to go visit other countries. I think that really, really hurt her chances of gaining momentum in Arizona. And I think that Democrats going forward have to learn from the failures and the mistakes of the Democratic Party this election cycle.
If Donald Trump enacts his mass deportation policy, it is going to be incredibly violent, incredibly disruptive for so many families across the U.S., ripping apart communities. So how do we raise awareness about this and highlight the violence of this plan while recognizing that, at least right now, in theory, it is popular?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is that, this is what voters want. So when this stuff happens, when we see mass deportations, the mayor of Phoenix here in Arizona has already said that Phoenix law enforcement is not going to engage in deporting people. They're not going to take part in it. The fact is just showing them when this happens, this is what they voted for. This is what they got, that it's going to hurt their own communities. Potentially, it could be their own neighbor who they don't even know is an immigrant. I think showing people that and relating it to them and showing them what is actually happening on the ground is going to be really impactful, right? We saw what happened in the first year of the Trump administration with the kids in cages, families in cages, showing people like that, showing things like that, what's going to happen, what we know is going to happen in the next year or two, showing things like that, I think will be powerful in itself to open up the eyes of voters who voted for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Those images are so powerful. And the images of war and violence across the world certainly had implications as well for this election. Now, in Ukraine, Donald Trump has made the case for pulling out U.S. weapons and support for the Ukrainian army and reaching a settlement with Russia, which he said he'll sign on day one, but, we'll see when that happens. In the Middle East, Trump has also threatened further escalation of the war between Israel and Hamas by continuing to provide Israel unrestricted access to American weapons and escalating tensions through military action with Iran. This is despite the fact that Trump received a large amount of support from Arab American voters who previously voted for Democrats in order to punish the Democratic Party in this election for its continued support for Israel, especially in the state of Michigan. In this campaign, Kamala Harris and Democrats broadly supported a ceasefire in the war in the Middle East. But Markus, why do you think that the party still is losing a large amount of trust, again, to that theme of trust, over this issue of the war, particularly from Arab American voters and from young people to Trump?
Because in the short term, Democrats were cowards when this issue came out. They saw the violence when this war first started. They knew what was happening, but they stayed silent for so long. And people noticed that. And I think people saw the Democrats doing this more for a political reason rather than doing it as the right thing to do. Standing up and acknowledging the genocide that's happening in Gaza. I think that is what happened, and people acknowledge that. And we've all know that Trump is some of his appointees and some of his, like the appointee to Israel, the ambassador, doesn't even believe that the people of Gaza should exist. We've seen rhetoric like that on the other side. But I think that this is what people voted for. And I think that the Democratic Party should have at the beginning acknowledged it, called them a ceasefire. And maybe that would have helped their chances with young voters and the Arab community.
Yeah, and I think to that point, it's really hard to tell young people, that you support a ceasefire and you're not willing to do anything to actually deliver it. Kamala Harris, throughout the campaign, really failed to specify what she would do differently from President Biden on this issue and a whole host of issues. And, right now, as you mentioned, a lot of people were hoping for change, and she wasn't willing to or able to, as she believed, provide that kind of difference from President Biden on this issue. And we'll never know what her policy would have actually been in the Middle East. But I think it's clear, this week with the Senate's vote on, restricting military aid to Israel, they weren't going to have the votes to make any meaningful change over the next few years in terms of ending this war and delivering a lasting, free Palestinian state. And I think young people saw that, and they said, if I'm not getting what I want from this party, I'm going to try something else. I don't care. It looks the same. And even though it's absolutely not, that was the perception. And that perception, determined this election. So, because of that, we have to talk about Trump's cabinet picks. So far, Trump and his transition team have selected a number of controversial individuals to fill key positions in the cabinet. Among these are Fox News weekend host Pete Hegseth to be defense secretary, vaccine conspiracy theorist Robert Kennedy Jr. to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, and Congressman Matt Gaetz, who was accused of child sex trafficking, to be Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement officer in the country. Now, at the time of this recording, Gaetz has rejected the attorney general position, but all of the other controversial picks are still looking likely to be confirmed to their positions in January with or without Senate approval, as Donald Trump has threatened repeatedly over the past few weeks to appoint those who do not get Senate approved or do not look like they're going to get approved by the Senate to recess appointments in the administration using a 1700s procedure to avoid the Senate confirmation process for the individuals who don't have the votes to be qualified to do the job. At the same time, Trump has also appointed a number of institutional figures like Congresswoman Elise Stefanik to be UN ambassador and Senator Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. Markus, what do you think of these cabinet picks so far, and how should we best communicate to young people in particular the dangerous implications of some of these more extreme individuals like Robert Kennedy Jr., who actually, have a significant following from a lot of young people over in the wellness spaces, in the vaccine skeptic spaces on social media?
Brace for impact. That's all I can say about Trump's cabinet pictures. I'm thinking back to SNL. I think it was this past Saturday. Did their Trump one-on-one in meeting and skit. There was a scene where the actor was who played Biden was like, can we play the picture of the guy in the fireplace who said this is fine? That's practically what we're all sitting back and saying to Trump's picks, is that this is fine while everything's burning down around us. These are terrible picks. I mean, these picks are just beyond what anybody. It's more like the entertainment world. I think of our cabinet's going to just be a bunch of entertainers, and they're so unserious, and they have no qualifications for the most part to be doing the jobs that they're doing.
Yeah, and I think we have to be careful though. We can't be talking about these cabinet picks in terms of their specific qualifications and stop there. We have to talk about the actual implications that these officials, through their incompetence or just through their plans for their departments, how they are going to harm young people and everyday people across the country. If vaccines become less available, people will die. Young people, kids will die because they won't have access to life-saving medications that keep them alive. That is a significant issue that we need to be highlighting. And, if we have irresponsible people running the military, we're going to have more conflicts in the world, not less. It's as simple as that.
I think the biggest thing is that, this was a lot of, we're seeing a lot of them only be loyal to Trump, right? I think that's all that matters to them. But I think we do know, like I mentioned in the past, when these people get the confirmations, when they get the jobs, we need to amplify and show folks what exactly they're doing, what exactly does the Secretary of Education do, what exactly does the Secretary of Defense do. I think that's what we need to show.
And as we mentioned before, what are they doing about prices? Nothing. They're not trying to lower prices right now. They're trying to play a game like they're on a TV set because that's what Donald Trump thinks the government is. He thinks it's funny. He thinks it's fun. He thinks he wants to, make it into a TV show because he thinks it's all a joke because he doesn't care if people get hurt. He doesn't care if the government's not working for ordinary people. He's rich. He can just take care of himself and he'll be fine. And his rich friends, they'll be fine. So we have to point out how dangerous this moment is. And we can't, forget about the central promise that Donald Trump did get elected on, which was to lower prices. And we need to carry that into the midterms and into the next presidential election. We need to say, Republicans, never again can they run on the economy and they don't have any actual plans to make people's lives or economic conditions any better. So how do we do that? Well, let's talk about the opposition to Donald Trump and the Republican government. After Trump's first election, left-wing activists formed what was called the Resistance to frame their organizing efforts in opposition to the Trump administration the first time around. These activists organized things like the Women's March and helped recruit progressive candidates, many of whom were women, to run for office in the 2018 midterm elections. But the resistance ultimately did fail to succeed at its ultimate task, to defeat Donald Trump permanently and make sure that he would not receive a second term in office. So, Markus, where do you think the resistance went wrong in fighting back against Trump last time? And what, if anything, can those in opposition to the Trump administration this time around do better to defeat Trump-style candidates in the future?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is just acknowledging that we are fighting for working class families issues. We're not fighting for corporate and special interest. I think people want candidates like Bernie Sanders, like AOC, candidates who literally just reflect everyday working people, and literally can relate to them and are willing to stand up and fight for them. I think the biggest thing too about why a lot of people support Trump-like candidates is because they say what's on their mind. They're not afraid to say their stuff, and they're not polished. I think that's the biggest reason. I think that's what people want to see more in their elected officials. But also, I think the other thing is that we also have to recognize that we have to do a lot of coalition building over the next year to prepare for the midterms. And that recognizes bringing in the entire party as a whole. But it's also recognizing how do we get our messaging to working class family voters. And I think that's the biggest thing that I think the Democrats need to focus on.
Yeah, I agree with that. I just think that we need to not make the same mistake that we did last time of forming a resistance bubble, right? Where people on the coast, people who were already offended by Donald Trump and never voted for him, tried to form groups of individuals in their communities who could provide kind of like emotional support. Obviously, that's important, but that's not how you win elections. And in order to win elections, you have to do what you just said, Markus. You have to connect with working class people outside of your bubbles. And we have to talk about issues that people are actually talking about. We need to focus less on the culture wars. We need to obviously be able to respond to the culture wars. That's important. But we have to be able to talk and deliver an economic message that connects with working people. And I think to your point, Bernie Sanders, AOC are incredibly strong messengers on economics to working class people. And right now, our party is going to have to decide what direction we want to go in. Do we want to focus more on trying to win over some of those Liz Cheney-style Republicans who are maybe tired of Donald Trump? Or are we going to go in a working class direction? Maybe offend some of those people, but deliver a candidate that can connect again with working class individuals. And I think we have a very clear result in this election about which pathway is more viable, right? We saw Kamala Harris campaigning in the last week with Liz Cheney. That did not move the numbers among working class people. It further disconnected those who were deciding this election from our party. So we need to get back to the roots of what made our party successful in 2008, in 2012, in years before then, and in 2020, in delivering an economic message that can connect with working people.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to really gear up our efforts to show folks what is in for the Trump administration next 4 years, and to really amplify those messages. You know, we just saw gas in my area go up by 50 cents over the last couple of days. So, and things continue to go up. And when they said it's going to go down. So, we're going to see what things like that really resonate and show that to voters in 2026. Already preparing for the next election cycle. A never ending in America. And told them that this is what they voted for and this is why we should hold them accountable on 26. So, it's counted upon all of us to pay attention and to be informed.
All right. That's it for Pod Save the Youth. This week, we'll be back with more content going into this crazy time. We're here with you. So thanks for listening to Pod Save the Youth, and we'll see you next time.